My guest this week is musician Nick Aguilar. Hailing from San Pedro, California, he's a dedicated musician for the last 16 years and has been playing drums around the greater Los Angeles area for about 10 of them. He's currently the drummer for LA-based psych punk group Frankie and the Witch Fingers, but also plays for the San Pedro-based death rock hardcore punk outfit Slaughterhouse, and in the past has toured with the mighty Mike Watt. In addition to his love of drumming, Nick is currently the resident DJ of the monthly soul, funk, and Latin club, The Goodfoot, at Alex's Bar in Long Beach, California, where he specializes in vintage soul, funk, garage, African, and Latin sounds. You can catch him every third Friday whenever he isn't on tour. It is my pleasure to welcome to Revolutions Per Movie, Nick Aguilar.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
Well, I wanted to ask you about San Pedro. Was that where you were born, or did you grow up there? Or?
Yeah, so I'm born and raised San Pedro. Been here my entire life. Obviously, I've traveled a lot in the last few years, but my home base has always been San Pedro, California.
To me, it was mythological. Minutemen were such an important band to me, but I had never heard of this city. I think besides REM being associated with Athens, I feel like Minutemen were right in line with total pride of their city and putting San Pedro on the map. And it had a real mystique to it. But I was curious to see what you thought of it in terms of its musical context, in terms of how people see it and how you see it.
Well, San Pedro has always been kind of a little bit of a weird town musically, in my opinion. When you really zoom out, and my apologies here if I talk slow, because I kind of want to be careful with my words here. Not because I'm going to say anything bad, but because I want to explain myself thoroughly and everything too. You know, I grew up loving music at a very young age because of my dad. And my dad went to San Pedro High, graduated class of 76, same year as the Minutemen graduated. They were all in the same, if you open up my dad's yearbook, you can see all of them in there. I'll show you later when we're done. It's pretty funny. Music was always very popular in the 70s and in San Pedro, and, you know, bands like Foghat would come and Zeppelin, and you sell out the Forum, and it's, you know, and that's music. That's what music was. And that's what people when people thought of playing in bands, you know, that's what people thought of. Specifically, I feel like in San Pedro. And Watt kind of talks about this a lot in the documentary. You know, Minutemen were kind of like the first, I think one of the first bands to really get out there and show that music is, you don't have to be this big rock star guy to do music, you know. Then that's the cool thing about the way they got into punk rock and everything. It's is you can do right in your own backyard. But I would say that culturally, San Pedro hasn't really been I would say that people generally here love music, but at the same time too, I feel like it's the younger people like me who are kind of learning more what's up there. And, you know, because there's a lot of, I don't know, for an example, there's something called Music by the Sea every Sunday. Not every Sunday, but it's every Sunday in July. All the bands that play are just kind of cover bands of just you know, classic rock songs and stuff like that. And, you know, it packs out. There's always at least 2,000 to 3,000 people there, from usually all from San Pedro, who show up and, you know, dance and, you know, listen to anything from Jethro Tull to Carlos Santana featuring Rob Thomas. But on an underground level, San Pedro definitely has a lot of cool things. I would say that the Minutemen definitely jump-started that for sure. And then throughout the 80s with SST Records and with Todd Congealier of Recess Records, and I know you played the Sardine, so you're familiar with that now.
Yeah, that was amazing. You know, what's interesting about the Sardine was, first of all, it was packed. You know, people came out, they were excited. But I also didn't know, this is how naive I am about geography, more than one person came up to the merch table and was like, San Pedro is not a town. It's we are part of LA. It's part of LA, correct?
Yeah, it is.
They were making distinctions where I was like, hey, it's really great to be in San Pedro. You know, I've never been here before. You've got a really cool thing going here. It's a cool town. And people are like, town? Did you just call us a town? They had a real pride, and it wasn't like they wanted to fight, but they definitely were don't forget next time you're through. It was really funny.
It's definitely a prideful town, and very blue collar and very working class. And it's got a lot of culture for sure too, with Croatian culture, Mexican culture, Italian culture, that goes above and beyond for sure. But if I'm talking about as far as underground cool music goes, it's there, but it's thanks to people like Mike Watt, D Boon, and people like Todd Congealier and Craig Ibarra. And Craig Ibarra is from Water Under the Bridge Records. Todd Congealier is from Recess Records. It's people like that who have made it also cool musically for the last 20 years in this town for sure. People like that, I definitely thank for influencing me for like where I am today.
Yeah, and I think that's essential. I mean, it's funny to think about, growing up in Portland, how it was so quiet in terms of, we had the Wipers and Poison Idea and some things, but
Yeah,
they didn't really tour and it was really underground and a
yeah,
lot of bands didn't come up here, but that things were happening, the same small amount of people were out and there was cool record stores and people to talk to. And I think, um, versus my friends who grew up in San Francisco or LA, where it was just everyone came through, or DC,
yeah,
and they
exactly.
had just more bodies, more influence. But I think again, maybe something like the Minutemen couldn't have happened anywhere else but San Pedro.
Man, it's a really interesting perspective, and maybe you're right. That's the thing. That's why I really, really, really enjoyed watching the documentary when I was a very young kid, just getting into the Minutemen. I think things happen by chance a lot of the times, and I think the Minutemen happening was a part of by chance, but almost fate, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's get into the movie a bit because there are amazing, one of the best origin stories of all of rock and roll ever. Just
Yeah,
But the film was made by fans of the band, director Tim Irwin and producer Keith Shiren. And they discussed making a documentary about Minutemen since they were in high school around 1989. It sounds like the two first approached Mike Watt about it, who gave them a thumbs up. They've also made that amazing Jawbreaker documentary too, Don't Break Down, same
that's
filmmakers,
right.
which has a very, very similar feel in terms of, somebody very close to the material, but very respectful to let just people tell the story.
Yep.
So when you saw the film, were you a fan of the Minutemen already? How old were you? Because you started playing drums really young.
So I started playing drums when I was 10, but I didn't really get into punk rock until I was about 12. And that's thanks to seeing Mike Watt for the first time. My dad's a longshoreman, like most people in California. I mean, like most people in San Pedro are. And my dad, back in the day, and I think every once in a while still works with Pete Mazich, who plays Hammond B3 organ in Mike Watt and the Second Men. And when I was like 12 years old, somehow my dad and Pete started talking, and Pete had another band back in the day called Johnny Angry, who named later changed their name to just the Angry. And the Angry were playing a show with Mike Watt and the Second Men. So Pete was doing double duty that night at a club, at an all ages bar nightclub in Long Beach called D Piazzas. It's still there. And my dad took me to the show basically just to see his friend's band play. Even though my dad went to high school with Mike Watt, he didn't know who he was, which is kind of the ironic thing about this whole story. So I remember I'm like 12 years old and I see my dad's friend's band play, and I'm just like, cool, this is cool. I like music, I guess. This is weird. And I remember like by the time Mike Watt is on, I think, oh yeah, it was Mike Watt and the Missing Men. It actually wasn't the Second Men. It was the Missing Men. So it was Tom Watson on guitar, Rawl on drums, and obviously Watt on bass. And I remember I like walk in like halfway through the set, and I remember they're playing Gloria Man. I don't even remember what the song. I didn't know what the song was. I just remember Mike being behind, Raw, like how he gets like behind drummers during certain songs, and seeing the drums up front, and I was like, this is a bunch of people up front, probably about 100 people there, maybe even less. And I'm just like, but the energy's crazy. And I'm just like 12 years old, and I'm like this chubby kid, like with a big ass flannel, and like I'm right up front. And I'm just like, and my dad walks in too, and he's like watching him too. And I remember my dad taking me home after, he's like, man, I don't think I've ever seen anything like that. And I was like, yeah, neither have I. I'm fucking 12 years old, for Christ's sake. And so that was like, so then I was kind of like, who the fuck is Mike Watt? What is this? And then my dad, he goes to work, and Pete gives him a CD of Double Nickels on the Dime to give to me. And then that was like my first taste of like what punk rock was. And I was just like, I thought punk rock was like Ramones and like Misfits and like,
Right.
shit like that. And I remember listening to this shit. I was like, man, this is fucking weird. Like, this shit sounds like dad rock almost. But like, I was hooked. And immediately I just like wanted to learn about, you open up the CD jewel case and then you see SST Records, and then you're like, who's Sonic Youth, who's Dinosaur Jr., who's Black Flag, who's the Meat Puppets. And then eventually I think that led to me discovering the documentary on YouTube or something like that. And, it's awesome. It literally starts off with like scenes of like where I live. And I see Mike Watt in his van, driving around like right by my house where I was living at the time. Obviously, the film was made in, I think it was filmed in 2003. And no, it was filmed in 2002 and came out in 2003. But it was like so cool to me. And, and like one of the first scenes is like Mike is walking through Point Fermin Park, where I just played a gig the other day, which is funny. And I'm pretty sure it was Point Fermin Park. Maybe you might want to fact check me on this later, but it's crazy because it's like by fate, because he's explaining walking through the park, and D Boon as a young boy and Mike Watt as a young boy, I think they were 12, 13 when they met. D Boon's playing Army with his friends, jumps out of a tree right in front of Mike, like by chance, because he thinks he's scaring one of his friends, but he's not. And he says, "You're not Eskimo." And Mike's like, "No, I'm not Eskimo. I'm Mike." Eskimo was like a name of one of D Boon's friends he was playing Army with, and I guess all of his friends ditched him. So Mike and D just started hanging out that day, and D, I guess, was talking with him on his way back to his house, and he's like, "Hey, you want to hang out?" And he, I think in the documentary he's talking about like he's just Dennis D Boon is just like saying a bunch of like bits, like comedy bits, and he's making Mike laugh, and Mike's like, "Dude, this is the funniest dude ever." But apparently, like, he was just referencing like a George Carlin record or like a Richard Pryor record or something that he showed him at his house like minutes later or something like that. And yeah. And then from that moment on, I was just like, this is the coolest thing ever.
The thing that I think the movie really captures is just chance and innocence.
Mm-hmm.
Just no expectations, but just the pure desire to make something and not know that it'll even ever be heard.
Oh, yeah.
When I met people making music originally in the 80s, it was like that. You would just bond on one simple thing and not even know who they were or where they came from or their history or if they're even healthy to be around. It was like you're just stuck with them. And the fact that they just met at such a young age and just developed like this kind of enjoyment and love for each other before even music entered their life is really special, I think.
Dude, yeah. Like it's a very, very beautiful thing. And that's why Mike Watt still to this day says when people ask him what kind of bass player are you, you know what he says?
I don't.
He says, I'm D Boon's bass player.
That's
Because
so beautiful. That's
because like, he wouldn't have started playing bass if he didn't start hanging out with D Boon, went over to his house, and his mom basically forcing them to play music.
Yes.
To stay away from, whatever bad shit. Just keeping them out of trouble,
Yeah, there's that great quote where a neighbor says, "How can you stand that racket?"
Oh, yeah.
That they're making. Yeah, she goes, "I know where my son is,"
Yeah.
And which is, I think the band ESG was a similar story.
Oh, I didn't know that.
The mom was like, "Let's get equipment and I'll know where you're at and you'll have something to do." One of my favorite things about them starting to make music together, and especially since Mike Watt, he's the reason I understood what a bass guitar was. I didn't really, when someone gave me my first Bells cassette, which has all the early records on one SST cassette, so it was Paranoia Time and punchline and, the EPs all together. When a song starts, like Bob Dylan wrote propaganda songs, you're just like, what is that sound? And you're like, I guess that's a bass. It's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
and it was
Yeah.
so fun to see Mike in this film talk about, I didn't know what a bass guitar looked like. I'd only seen it on stage in an arena. So he was in a music guitar shop looking at it, thinking it was a
Yep.
guitar and being like, this guitar is 4 strings. It's so weird. And
Yeah.
just somebody being like, what are you looking at? He's like, this guitar is weird. He's like, that's a bass guitar. He's like, oh yeah, I know that. But he
Yeah.
didn't. Just so many stories like that make this movie really, really special.
That part, I remember that part is just, honestly, every scene in that movie is ingrained into my head, but it's just so funny because I could just picture a young Mike looking at that. He's like, oh yeah, that's a bass. He's like, oh yeah, I know that. And he's like, but I fucking didn't know. Like, yeah. He learned in the most like accidental ways and is a legend now. It's just insane.
At one point, Flea in the movie talks about how
Yeah.
they didn't even know to be in tune with each other for 2 years. Someone would be like, I like my guitar strings, or I like my strings tight. And the other one would be like, I like mine loose, which is kind of like amazing because you imagine learning cover songs without knowing how it's tuned and just how much more work it was. So by the time they tuned, I'm sure it was like taking weights off, like running with weights and taking them off. And all of a sudden they're like, this is way easier. And they just kind of jumped the line.
People think the Germs did it like bad, like, but nah, like, can you imagine like not like, yeah, I mean, you've had the perfect analogy with the weights and everything. Yeah.
The film is anchored with a 1985 interview with the band, and also Mike Watt driving around San Pedro and pointing out sites like where they first met and where they first had their first performance as the Reactionaries, I believe. Correct?
That's correct. In 1979, that's when they formed.
Do you know much about the Reactionaries? Did Mike talk much about them when you were playing with him?
Um, Not really. He did talk a little bit about Martin Tamburovich, the original singer. He died in 2003 of a really crazy flesh-eating disease, like virus, that
Oh, that's horrible.
killed him in like hours, like literally like ate his cells from like the inside out, and like it's crazy. But I do know, if you have any, like, I guess, have any questions or curiosity about the Reactionaries, I do have a pretty solid knowledge about that band because eventually that was the band that led to the Minutemen, obviously, and I'm a huge Minutemen fan and almost like a historian in a certain way. So
Yeah, it's so hard to imagine them going further with a singer and not being a three-piece. Like, they could have gone that way.
yeah,
I mean, they already had a show with Black Flag and, the Alley Cats, but it's also a testament to youth to be like, I don't think we want this. Yeah, I don't think we want a singer. Just being adaptable and not worrying about, is this right or it's wrong. It's just like, this is what I feel like I want to do.
yeah, that was, and it became, when you talk about the greatest power trios of all time, I think a lot of people who know even remotely what's up think of the Minutemen for sure.
Yeah, and so as a drummer, you're 12, and you're already playing drums, and I'm assuming you're playing different stuff, not Minutemen style stuff.
Yeah.
Did seeing this film and having, these records, did it change your course in terms of style and in terms of how you wanted to approach thinking about drumming? Because George Hurley is singular.
Yeah, dude, I'll tell you right now, like listening to Double Nickels in particular, and especially after watching We Jam Econo, and listening to the way how George talked about basically teaching himself how to play drums, and like he said something, I remember that he said something in the movie. It's just like, when you're starting out, you don't really know what you're doing, and you try so hard not to suck, you kind of like do certain like weird things that might be outlandish in certain aspects, but like they end up being super unique and very influential. And yeah, man, to answer your question, 100%, like watching this film and discovering the Minutemen in general totally changed my and opened up my world to music, to a whole different like world of music in general. Before I was kind of only into like whatever my dad was into and
Mhm.
adjacent to what my dad listened to. Like, like I got into Metallica and Iron Maiden and Judas Priest and shit when I was like 11 because my dad liked Black Sabbath and Deep Purple, but because of the Minutemen, I discovered so much stuff. John Coltrane, everything basically on SST Records. Uh, I remember when I was young, and after I would go see Mike play when I was like 13, I got his email because he gave it to me, and I remember I would be like, "Hey, who was this song by?" Like that you played. He's like, "Oh, that song was called We Are Time by the pop group." So like, I don't know, what 13-year-old do you know, like, who even had any idea who the pop group was? And I discovered the urinals because of that too. I was like studying him. Yeah, I would go to so many, any chance I would see Mike at a young age, I would like study him and study the songs and study his drummers, Raul Morales, who plays in the Mystic Men, and Jerry Trebetich, who plays in the Second Men. Like those dudes are like by default, like are in my top five like influential drummers of all time, and George included. And George I run into a lot in town still, and he is such a nice guy. Yeah.
Yeah, it was so funny, seeing the Minutemen, like in this film. George just seems so different than Mike and D Boon in terms of how he carries himself, how he's performing. I mean, they were a chemistry band, that basically were amazing at listening to each other. They're all playing these different amazing things that don't seem like they will come together, but they do. And the
Mm-hmm.
choices are really interesting. Like, I was listening to Paranoia Time, and the first song is just like, it's only like 48 seconds long, but like the last 9 seconds are just a D Boon guitar riff all alone, and then just bump.
Yeah.
How they could just be like, I'm going to stop right now, unlocking those things, that psychic conversations they could have, the unspoken stuff, just made them stand out compared to so much hardcore and punk that was going on at the time.
Totally. And what's really cool specifically about that EP in general, which they talk about in the documentary, is that that was SST number two.
I know, it's incredible.
That was the second release. Yeah. Like this little band, I think Ian MacKaye says in the documentary, Black Flag, with the little money that they had, just for the sake of like maybe expanding the label and maybe thinking of the fact that they were from Pedro was cool and they were doing something a little bit remotely different. It's like, let's put out their 7-inch. It's really cool that the first two releases on SST Records are sonically different. They're almost like the complete opposite of each other when you really listen to them back and forth.
No, it's not like another Black Flag sounding band, or like we've got this, SST sound. It comes out of total left field. And as much, I mean, the Greg Ginn conversation is very complicated.
Yeah.
Karmically, it's kind of amazing, for him and Chuck, they didn't have any money. They just were excited. And it's such an amazing EP. That when I got that just split my head open. I just thought I couldn't stop listening to it.
That was interesting for me to listen to as well too, because like I had to go like backwards in the Minutemen catalog because I started with Double Nickels, and it was cool to kind of start over from the beginning and see like how they like progressed and like with their sound and everything. And obviously it's a lot more minimal, but as they got older and as they started playing more, the sound obviously expanded a lot and in certain ways. But yeah, that EP is fantastic. And Paranoid Chant is obviously, I feel like I don't know, the one like hardcore song on there, but it's still kind of like weird.
Yeah, but Paranoid Chant's interesting because I rewatching this video, this documentary, had kind of forgotten how much Mike, and maybe you can correct me on this, Mike wrote songs that D sang, correct?
Yes.
I was kind of shocked going through the credits recently how many songs that he wrote for Dee to sing.
Yeah, yeah. Watt wrote. I think it's funny. I think specifically, not to take away from Paranoid Time, but I think specifically Watt wrote, I think, almost like every song on What Makes a Man Start Fires, at least the music or something like that. I guess they really looked out for I don't know. Maybe, I don't know why that is the case. I think Mike maybe thought that Dee was a better singer in a way, but why that is, I don't exactly know why, but yeah.
Yeah, and George wrote quite a few songs, more than I thought too.
Yeah, he was a great lyricist as well. Yeah.
Let's talk about the lyrics a bit. Like, you discover them, and you've heard the Ramones and the Misfits, and all of a sudden the Minutemen's, political poetry shows up in your life. For me, it was like there were certain things they were singing about that I had to become aware about. I had to like pick up a newspaper for a change and understand what they were singing about.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because honestly, probably no. Like, looking back, probably not. Um, I don't know. I remember, I think my favorite song being on Paranoid Time was probably Joe McCarthy's Ghost, and I was like, who the fuck is Joe McCarthy, dude?
Totally.
Yeah. Or even like with Paranoid Chant, those lyrics specifically too. How's it start? What's the first lyric again? I try to go to work, and I keep thinking of World War III. I try to talk to girls, I keep thinking of World War III. Yeah, it's goddamn 6 o'clock, and I don't know. It definitely made me realize. I mean, one thing's for sure, they hated Reagan. But I think a lot of punk bands did at the same time too. But I think they really did it in a very unique way compared to a lot of the other bands at the time. Yeah.
It was kind of fun to hear them talk about, writing lyrics, and also their admiration for Richard Meltzer as a lyricist and a hero, and, their eventual potential collaboration. I know they did a little work on Buzz and Hal, or Buzz or Hal, right?
Yeah, Buzz or Hal.
Yeah, compared to so much that was going on at the time, it was just poetry, and I didn't know it at the time.
Well, Mike is a really big fan of James Joyce.
I didn't.
Yeah, well, James Joyce?
Yes.
I think he wrote, well, Ulysses is the big one. And Mike, I remember I bought that book on tour because it was so cheap when I was on tour with him a few years ago. And because, he talks about it so much, and, I don't know if you get his emails, but I think on June 16th, he sends out Happy Bloomsday every June 16th. And he was kind of talking to me, I'm not going to lie, man, I'm not that smart. And, or maybe I'm just not that, it's hard for me it's all about stream of consciousness, he would say. And, that's kind of like what Double Nickels is specifically too. A lot of those lyrics are kind of like thinking out loud, streams of consciousness. And Mike told me that a lot of the lyrics on that record specifically were very inspired by that book, because he's read it like twice. I think like once when he was when he was 20, and then again later in his 40s or something like that. And he said that, like, a lot of the songs on that record, like World According to Nouns, Gloria Man, specifically a lot of the songs that he wrote are very inspired by that. And a lot of those lyrics are just, I don't really know what they mean, but it's rad. Like Time Monitor, Flame Child, like, I don't know. No one knows what that fucking means, man, but it's awesome.
It's so good. I mean, it's so, it's done with such conviction. One of the greatest things in the documentary is that it's, for the time, a lot of live footage captured
Totally.
from their early shows, how they got spit on, and the punks weren't really, they were just like, the audience wasn't ready for the Minutemen.
No,
they were like, this is not punk rock. And they were like, hey, it doesn't matter what you wear, what you think, what you do. It's like, it's punk rock. We're punk rock, and you have to catch up.
Yeah. That show that they're specifically talking about is when they were playing at the Starwood in, I believe it was 1980, and they were really young. and D is like barely talking at all. And yeah, there's like a point in the
Yeah.
documentary on that filming where like Mike gets pissed off. He's just like, we're playing it with two chords. Is that like enough for you guys spitting? And like, like I want to hear your band. I want to hear your band.
Yeah, I think he says I'm playing it with two strings.
Oh
I
yeah,
think
I'm playing with two strings. Yeah, that's
yeah,
it.
and
Yeah,
it's and D looks pretty pissed.
yeah.
They just are like, here's the next one. Boom.
It wasn't easy, and it's sad too because like I love that whole performance, man. Like I remember being young and watching that. I was like, man, they were so young, and
I know
like
they're babies.
people are barely into this, and like a lot of those songs weren't even recorded on record. Some of those, like Contained, Hollering, those are like Minutemen deep cuts, and like I remember I would watch that all the time and just be hooked on it. And I remember I asked Mike about that scene, and I think he's kind of embarrassed by it. He was like, "Yeah, I like that was dumb. Like I lost my cool. Like I was young and just got angry." And I don't even think a Mike Watt even in '83 or '84 would even get that upset. But it was tough times. Punk was fucking new, and they were punk was already weird, and they were the the black sheep of the already black sheep.
Well, you mentioned the pop group,
Yeah.
and you can go to the pop group, and they talk about in the film obviously an influence, but the Minutemen don't sound like the pop group.
No.
You know what I
No.
mean? They're like it's like, okay, there's some scratchy, funky guitar tone,
Yeah.
and there's some amazing bass stuff, but it's like, oh, REM and Big Star. It's like, okay, whatever.
Yeah.
It's like they're influenced, but
Not the same thing.
it's not the same thing at all. And, I just, again, that accidental combination of the three of them. I mean, George comes in to replace somebody who has quit the band on their first recording because it's devil's music or whatever.
That's right. Yeah. Frank Tonchi, I think, was that drummer or something like that.
It just gels. And so, then, right after that, you got the punchline, and then what makes a man start fire. And it's just a total run, like many bands in the 80s, like 2 albums a year. But this music, it blows my mind that it was 80, 81. When you think about what else was going on musically at the time, it's just so early. Like I was listening to like Devo and things like that I thought were adventurous and dangerous.
Oh, and it still is.
But it
Yeah.
is, but like it in a totally different way than like the Minutemen were, and it's just like, oh, that came out the same year as Freedom of Choice,
It's crazy.
and it sounds like nothing else on the earth.
No, not at all. Yeah.
The film is great because it moves through their growth and the recording, going through the different records. The band definitely started kind of pulling away from the short stuff around, what was it, Project Mersh, you would say, or maybe even Buzz and Howl. Songs are getting longer.
Yeah. Yeah. I think their first song over 2 minutes was the anchor on What Makes a Man Start Fires. I think Mike actually says that in the documentary. I think he's looking at the track list. He's like, yeah, this is our first song over 2 minutes. And he's like, oh, wow, it's 2:30 or something like that. So
It's like the opus. Yeah.
yeah, he says that. He's like, oh, our opus, jokingly. And then it goes into a live clip of them playing it. In fact, I'm not a bass player, but that's like one of the few songs I could play on bass because it's so.
I bought a bass guitar because of Mike Watt.
That's awesome.
Try and learn toadies and things, just trying to learn his songs and give up on things that were impossible.
Yeah.
But it was fun to, like, oh, I can kind of figure out the maze a little bit, and then half of it and the other half I can't.
Well, it's interesting too because he talks about in the documentary too that I think Buzzer Howl was the last project that he played on where he used a pick, and then everything after that he started using his fingers. I can't remember exactly why he started to do that change, but yeah, you could definitely hear the difference on a lot of the obviously post Buzzer Howl.
Yeah, and they were such a fun band to get records in real time of, like Double Nickels. It just leveled everything. I mean, it is really funny. They talk about in the film it was basically a knee-jerk response to Zen Arcade.
Exactly.
You know, they're like, Husker Du came to town. We heard they have a double album. We want a double album. And so I believe that they wrote a bunch of new songs
Yep.
and just slammed them in. It's just one of the greatest American albums of all time. It's just classic. It's flawless.
It's my favorite record of all time for a lot of reasons, but and it's definitely been the longest album that I've liked since I was, I'm 26 now. I discovered when I was 12. And do I listen to it every day or that much these days? Not so often, but whenever I have an inkling or want to feel like inspired to throw it on, I never regret it. And certain songs I love more in different times in my life. Like I remember when I was younger, I didn't really care for shit from an old Notebook that much, but of course I liked it, but as I'm older, it's like one of my favorite songs on that record now. And same with like World According to Nouns and
Sure.
uh I don't know, even the weirder ones like Take 5D, it's fucking such a weird record, man. Like there's nothing, and like who puts a fucking live cover of a Creedence song on
Yeah.
an album? They did.
Yeah, Van Halen.
Yeah. 40, I think it's like a 45-second version of Ain't Talking About Love. Amazing.
But in a way, it was like a middle finger and also like a love letter to
Yeah.
it. You know, it's like we kind of love it, but you know, we kind of hate it at the same time. It's just like and that's how I felt about music a lot. You know, it was really it's hard to overstate just how what a badge it was. The music you loved at that time was such a shield and so defined you and caused arguments and fights and those covers that they started bringing in like CCR and who else do they cover on? They do 4 covers, right? Isn't that right?
I need on that record specifically. Yeah, there's a few, yeah, they do Dr. Wu by Steely Dan.
Yeah, who I'd never heard at the time. I never heard that song.
Love that version. I love their version of Dr. Wu. It's so good.
It's really funny.
Yeah, Ain't Talking About Love's on there. Don't Look Now by Creedence is on there. Man, that I think that's it. I think that's the only.
Okay.
I think there's only 3 covers on that record. But yeah, they did cover a lot.
Yeah, because maybe I'm thinking of the tours. There was a Tour Spill EP that came out too. I remember that had live versions of those tracks. That was on, I think, Reflex maybe or New Alliance or something like that.
They also do a version of Hey Lottie Mama on Project Mersh, which is kind of like a traditional cover, but I think they were doing like the Steppenwolf version. Three-Way Tie for Last, their last record has like Styx cover songs or something. Yeah.
Has Bermuda by Rocky Erickson.
Yeah, I love their version of that.
The growth into double nickels, it just seems right and mature and like, but it sounds like the Minutemen still. Every song is very different. When you heard Project Mersh or the later albums, did it feel radically different to you? Because I mean, it's still the Minutemen, and I love Project Mersh. It's just a weird little stopgap, of growth. At the time, it was kind of shocking.
Yeah.
How traditional it was.
Yeah. I remember as a kid listening to all the Minutemen stuff and going throughout the discography. I remember that being like sonically different, obviously.
Right.
Like you would have to be deaf to not be able to tell the difference. But that didn't mean I didn't like it any less than the other stuff, for sure. Like The Cheerleaders is a dope song.
That's a great song.
Yeah. King of the Hill, I remember watching the music video a bunch too as a kid. And my friend Brandon, who I'm not that close with anymore, but we're still hang and talk from time to time. I remember him and I would reference that music video all the time at school when we were in 8th grade and stuff. And how exactly, I don't remember.
Of course, they're just wanting to do whatever they want. So many bands were changing then their sound, especially the SST bands were growing by leaps and bounds in terms of from their initial influences or their first record.
Yeah. And that's the thing that has always resonated with me. Mike said that punk rock to him was not about playing, simple chords or playing really fast. It's about letting your freak flag fly. And that's what gave them the opportunity to do that. And punk rock allowed them to kind of essentially do whatever they want until the unfortunate reason why, the Minutemen stopped playing.
Right.
And they did that, yeah, until the day D Boon died, which is awesome. They just did whatever they wanted. And they were on the road to only getting bigger.
Yeah, they were basically touring with REM. Just got off a tour when D Boon died, and they were set to do a really interesting sounding project with Richard Meltzer writing lyrics. That would have been really fascinating to see I know that they Watt and Meltzer did end up working together later on.
Yeah, I think Meltzer is in We Jam Econo as well too, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, he's in there a lot, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, and I remember where I was when I found out that D Boon died. It was really powerful moment. I didn't know him, but one of the bands I loved the longest in my life at that point, and just it was like in the base. It was a house party that Poison Idea were playing.
Wow,
and
that's crazy.
The bass player for the Oily Bloodmen, that John McIntyre from Tortoise was originally in.
Was he there? Was he there too, John?
Probably, but I don't
Yeah.
remember him being there. But Charlie came up and said, "Did you hear?" And just such a horrible, lonely feeling, because it was just somebody who I felt like musically just mattered, and just sang from the heart, and was so beautiful and opinionated and emotional. And that was very, very, it was just horrible. And that feeling of, oh man, like it felt like they were on to something as a band. I just was excited to see where they were going to go.
Oh, I can only imagine you being a fan at the time too, like you and so many other people. Me, I discovered them almost 25 years later of
Right.
them not being a band anymore. So when I learned that, like, oh wow, this guy's dead, it was kind of like an unfortunate thing to hear, even like a dude who just discovered like his to be favorite band and the most important band is in his entire life. I'm talking about me, third person. Yeah, yeah.
The
Sorry.
Minutemen were the one that meant the most to me out of all the SST bands. They didn't sound like anything else, and they just spoke to me. And they, out of all those bands, they, even more than Black Flag or anything, they made it seem possible. Like, they were amazing musicians. They can play, but I don't know, for some reason those records are really welcoming instead of really like, oh, you can't get this.
Yeah, yeah. It didn't really feel like, I remember being a kid, listening to that for the first time. It didn't feel like outsider. Like, obviously it was weird, but it felt like accessible too. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that the lyrics, a lot of it was like kind of like ironic and like tongue in cheek, kind of almost like funny to me. I remember like almost scoffing at a lot of the names of the songs, like,
Sure.
Bob Dylan wrote propaganda songs, Beacon Sighted Through Fog. I'm looking at them right now, and I specifically remember like those names of songs. They sound like poetry, like the way they're like. I think someone says in the documentary, a lot of the songs are like almost like haiku, and like
Right.
the songs are structured like that too. Like, even on Double Nickels, one of the more, I guess, accessible, quote unquote, accessible records, there's still only like 3 choruses on that like entire fucking record. A lot of those songs are like just, like Mike said, stream of consciousness. It's just like one part, one part, one part, one part. And I still like to write songs like that with my band. And, a lot of our songs on the new record, well, not a lot of them, but like I think there's like 3 songs that don't even really have a chorus, and they just, just like a straight shot, like in one of our most singles like that, and I feel like that's very Minutemen inspired.
Can we talk a bit about what it was like working with Mike in terms of, his work ethic? And his touring ethic is legendary. Was it a surprise? Did it seem like this is exactly how I thought it would go from just knowing the history of the Minutemen and Firehose?
So how I actually started playing with Mike is a kind of a complicated, long, convoluted story, but I'll try to give you like the short end of it. earlier in this conversation, we talked about how I saw Mike for the first time, and when I just wanted to see him again and again and again, so I saw him whenever I could, and somehow my dad and Pete started talking, and Pete thought it would be cool if I played a song with them on stage. So when I was like 12 years old, I learned the shit out of This Ain't No Picnic.
That's amazing.
And I went and saw them, and I saw them. There's a video on YouTube too. I'll send you the link so you can watch it. And I'm 12 years old, and I go see Mike Watt and the Second Men, and Jerry gets out for one song. And this is my first time meeting Mike, and I remember I just gave him like a little fist bump or something. And Mike didn't really know what to expect. I think he thought there was probably like 50 people there at this show at DiPiazza's, and Mike didn't know what to expect. And I think he thought he was just kind of doing like, his buddy a favor kind of thing. But honestly, dude, no ego here. For being a fucking 12-year-old man, I nailed that song. And I think I kind of like shocked him a little bit. And then after that show, he was like, "You want to learn a couple more and do it again in like couple months? I had a different show that I'm playing."
Amazing.
And I'm like, "Yeah, sure." And like I learned Little Man with a Gun in His Hand, and I learned Gloria Man. And I remember like it was April of like 2010 April 2010. I'm like in 7th or 8th grade, and there's a crazy show going on in Pedro at this old dive bar called Harold's Place, and it's some benefit show for like a new PA system that Craig Ibarra was putting on, and Mike was playing. And I remember like I couldn't go in because I was 21, and I showed up with my dad, and my dad was like, he tipped the door guy $20 to let me in so I could go in and play. And I started the set, and there's also a video of this, and Mike's like, "All right, we got 12-year-old Nick." And like, yeah, I play those 2 songs, and I do my thing and get the hell out of there. And yeah, and I just, I went home, and George Hurley showed up later that night, and
Oh my God.
he didn't get to see me play, but my dad showed him on the camcorder, and George's like, "Oh yeah, you're doing that right," kind of thing. And
Oh, that's so sweet.
so as I got older, I would, every once in a while, Mike would kind of let me on stage to play a song, but I kind of stepped away from doing it when it kind of stopped being quote unquote cute. When I turned like 15, 16, I was like, okay, I'm not really going to do this anymore. He never said like, don't do this anymore, like it's weird. I kind of was just like, I kind of just want to be like a fan and appreciate it at this point. But when I was 19, Jerry Trebetich of the Second Men, Mike Watt and the Second Men, broke his arm, and Raul, his other drummer, had to go to a wedding in Mexico or something. So Mike called my dad and was like, because they were friends at this point now, and was like, "You think because he calls me Big Man. And he was like, "You think Big Man could do a full set?" And my dad was like, "Are you fucking kidding me?" "Yeah." And then he's like, "All right, okay, cool." And then like somehow I filled in for 2 gigs in like June of 2016, and did like 30 something songs with him, and both with Tom, one with Tom Watson. I filled in for a Missing Men one show, and I filled in for the Second Men one show. And I think that proved to Mike that like, okay, yeah, I could do it. So in 2019, when Raul had a baby and couldn't really be away for home for 7 weeks, 6.5 weeks, 7 weeks, I got the call to, do that tour, the Dick Watt tour, and tour with Mike and Tom for the Missing Men. And yeah, preparing for that tour was pretty, let's just say rigorous and a little backbreaking, and a lot of like him jamming it into me like, "Nah, fucking do it like this, you got it." Like it was a lot of like, not tough love, but it kind of like harsh, like positive reinforcement. If I couldn't get something, he'd be like, "Hey, you think these songs are fucking easy?" or something like that. I'm like, "No." He's like, "Well, how it's like, how, like, you're doing them." I'm like, "Yeah, you're right." And it in a way, like it was very inspiring. And him and I practiced every day for a month straight until we left for tour.
Amazing.
Other than the day my grandma died. Mm-hmm. Then 10 days before it wasn't even 10 days. I think it was like 6 days before we left for tour. Because even if Tom couldn't get together, me and Mike would get together, because we lived so close to each other. I'd pick him up. We go to his studio, run the set, just drum and bass, and then go home. You know, there was no excuse not to take an hour out of each of our day just to meet up and do that. And that really like ingrained the songs into my muscle memory, not just for the tour, but honestly, man, if I had to go play with Mike tomorrow, I probably could. No ego talking here. Those songs that I played on that tour are ingrained into my brain, man. And doing that tour with him was crazy, man. It was 45 shows in 45 days. Some of the best shows I've ever played in my life. And people said, like, how'd you do that? Like, how wasn't that hard? Like, that's a crazy tour. And I'm like, yeah, man, sure. It was a lot, but it was awesome because like I had a job to do every day. You know,
Right.
I had something to look forward to every day. It felt like going to work every day. And I was healthy. I ate good every day. I was making good money because we were playing every day. You know, Mike says, if you're not playing, you're paying.
Right.
And that's fucking true, man. You know, and it was awesome, you know, and there was a lot of tough times on that tour, where it was kind of funny on nights where I felt like I didn't do the best. He'd kind of be like, "No, you're fine, big man. You're tripping." Like, "Nah, that was fine." But on the nights where I felt like I did good, he was like, "Nah, you rushed that part." Like, "Hey, big man, you got to watch that part." I'm just like, and at one point, you know, at some like literally a week into the tour, I literally kind of shortly realized, like, yeah, I'm not going to win any conversation with this man whatsoever.
Well, yeah, and that's hinted at in the documentary. I mean, Dee and his relationship was surprisingly volatile.
Oh, dude. And he was like that with Tom too, man. And with me. It's kind of just like, you can't get a word in. At one point, you kind of just got to just like, not tune him out, but just kind of like really take in everything that he's saying. And
He's Mike Watt. No one else is like him.
no one, man, out of all the weirdo punk legends and even rock stars I've met in my life, Mike is still on a scale of like 1 to 100. If I've met the weirdest rock star in the world, he's at like 50. Then there's Mike Watt, who's like at 100. Like he is like unlike any other person on the planet. And I've talked to Tom Watson about it too. You know, he's played with Mayo Thompson from the Red Crayola. And I was like, what's that like? He's like nothing like playing with Mike at all. Like,
Wow.
You think Mayo Thompson's fucking weird? Nah, Mike is fucking weird, dude. Like,
that's beautiful.
And yeah, and that's all with due respect too. You know, like Mike is self-aware of how intense he is, and
yeah.
But that's also a reason why he's been doing it for so long and is so well respected. And yeah, you know.
Yeah, he's just incredible. And whenever he's interviewed or people talk about him, I mean, he's beyond like a grandfather or father figure of the scene. He's just Mike Watt. I just wanted to say I saw you on that tour in Portland.
Yeah.
And it was, I cried a couple times because there were songs that I'd never heard live before. And it was amazing. It was such an amazing, respect is not the right word, but it was just really beautiful how everyone respected the original songs and really paid attention. You guys played like it mattered, and Mike's lived in those songs forever. And I just thought it was really beautiful how you and Tom's the guitar player, correct?
Yeah, Tom Watson.
Yeah, just were right there with him.
No, yeah, I'll never forget that show because I think it was the third or fourth show of that tour, because we started in Santa Cruz, and then I think we played in Sacramento, and then I think we did Eugene. No, we did whatever. It was early in the tour, and it was like it was like show number 5 or 6, and yeah, I remember that show was crazy to me because that was my first time at Mississippi Studios, and I thought that venue was fucking awesome. I remember Lance Bangs showing up to film it. Still want to see that footage, Lance, by the way, if you ever listen to this. It's been years. Just so I could yell at my own mistakes. Yeah, I just remember I really felt the love in that room that night. That was the show to remember. I'll never forget that show for sure. And I remember I met you the next day too at Eric Dayton's house where you guys did I'm not going to call it a podcast, Mike's online radio show, because he gets mad we call it the P word. He says.
Yeah, I was totally honored to just spend time with Mike. And I wanted to ask him questions. I was like, so what was the first time that you got the courage to go to a show, you know? And he's like, oh yeah, me and Dee were sitting on like the side of the road and some punk rocker walked by and was like, you should go to the show in Hollywood or something. Just, innocent things where they had to get the courage up to go. Like, should we go? I don't know, like, well, yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. Which I could relate to because it took me 3 times to go to my first hardcore show. I just would stand outside and be like, they're going to tear my head off the moment I walk into this room. And then walked in and there was like 13 people and it was fine. But you're in my head, I built up this thing where it's like, I don't look punk at all, like
Yeah.
they're gonna murder me. Yeah, it was really but it was a great show and everyone was talking about you. They were just like, who is this guy? Who's playing all these really complicated George
I'll
Hurley.
tell you right now, I think a reason why, obviously, I had to work a lot for that tour and a lot of rehearsing to do for that tour. But to be honest with you, Chris, no ego here, man. No ego here. I think a big reason why a lot of those songs, at least like the core and the chunk of them, when me and Mike started practicing, I went in there being like, I know these fucking songs. Other than like the 7 songs that were like added into the set that were like some new covers to me that I had to learn. Like we covered like a Blue Oyster Cult song I never heard and like a Rocky Erickson song that he kind of picked apart and did his own way. Specifically the Minutemen stuff. I kind of already knew the meat and potatoes of a lot of that stuff because I was, jamming to it and listening to it for like over 10 years of my life at that point. Um, so obviously once I started jamming with Mike, I'm like, I go in there being like, okay, I'll know this shit. And then like literally like a minute into the first song, he's just like, no, I gotta do it like this, gotta do it like this. I'm like, okay, maybe I don't know these songs as well as I do. But, you know, George is one of my favorite drummers. And I think me, being so passionate about drumming and, you know, getting this gig of a lifetime for me, I was like, I really want to give it my all and do my thing, but stay true to the original feel of how those songs originally played too. And it's really funny because I remember I played a show with my old punk band Neighborhood Brats in 2021, kind of like when shows started to come back again at the Sardine for the first Big Foist, which is a festival that they do at the Sardine, obviously named after the Minutemen song. And I remember George's newer project called the Wrinkling Brothers played, and it's like it's just a 2-piece band with him and this guy named Joe, and they play. He plays bass, and George plays drums. And I remember we played after, and George, him and I barely talked about my band that played Neighborhood Brats, but I remember he just kind of just like taps me on the shoulder. He's like, because he's seen me play with Mike like proper at this point now, and he said to me like, "Man, Nick, I don't know anyone who plays Minutemen songs as good as you do, man." And I was just like, and kind of like blurted it out mid conversation or something like that. And me, I don't know, I could have just helped but just sit there and just laugh because it's just like, dude, what is my life? How many people? That's like the compliment. That's probably like the greatest compliment I could ever receive from anyone. Like my favorite drummer telling me that I play his parts better than anyone else is just insane to me, man. Like, as we're like sharing a fucking Modelo together, it's a trip. It's a trip.
It's hard to argue with him, though. I've seen you do it. It's amazing. Anybody who has not had the privilege of seeing Nick perform for any of his bands, get on it. Wrapping up here, I always like to ask people a couple things. One, is there anything you feel is missing from the film at all? Like, I would have liked to know more about this, or, there was footage that I'd heard about that didn't really make the cut.
I really like that documentary in a sense where I feel like it's a very straight shot of a lot of information and a lot of different people on a lot of different interviews, but it feels so cohesive. And I feel like it tells the story so well. I guess it would have been nice to learn a little bit more about the aftermath of what it was like when Dee passed away. but maybe that's a reason why it was left out, is because it was the story of the Minutemen, the time when they were a band, and not too much of the sad aftermath that came from it. I would have liked to know a little bit more, I guess, about that, and like what the air was like after he passed in the scene and what it really did. I feel like the movie kind of ended almost a little abruptly when we learned that Dee died, and I think he says it ends with him like saying poetry, and yeah, but maybe it's also good in that regard. I think they were technically a band for 5 years. The 5 years of them.
5 years.
I think that was it.
Yeah, you're right. That's that.
Yeah.
That is blowing my mind. I mean, obviously I know it, but I just have never said it out loud.
There's not a lot of bands other than say what you want about the Smiths. They were only a band for 4 years and put out a huge, incredible amount of songs in just 4 years. Minutemen put out, sonically very different and a lot shorter, but the 5 years that they were a band left a mark of a lifetime. There's not a lot of bands that could do that. So who can only imagine what they could have done if they kept going.
And it's interesting, they obviously influenced a lot of people, but I don't hear bands that sound like the Minutemen. I just don't. It's like you can't do that. Such a cool magic that they had.
People, I feel like a lot of bands who I listen to them, I'm like, oh yeah, these guys like the Minutemen for sure, but no one will ever sound like them. You hear a Minutemen song, you're like, yeah, this is the Minutemen.
Yeah, within a second or two, you're like either Dee's voice or the guitar or the bass or George's drumming, or it's just immediately, oh, Minutemen.
Yeah, those are the best bands for sure.
Yeah. Do you have push come to shove? Do you have a favorite record of theirs?
Dude, I love all of them for different reasons, but it's got to be Double Nickels for sure, dude. Like, I know that's the the consensus, and that's their best record, but it really is, for a record that has, I think, total of 45 or 43 songs on it, there really isn't a dull moment,
No.
And it's just so influential, and there's nothing else that sounds like it. And yeah, it's still a very important, not just piece of music to me, but a piece of history,
It is a piece of history. And I think for the American underground at the time, it was quite a statement.
Yeah. And like you just said, for the American underground and music in general of the 80s, I'm glad that it finally has so much recognition. I think Pitchfork even put it in the top 10. I think they did a 200 top 200 records of the 80s, and I think Double Nickels was in the top 20, I think, or something, which is pretty fucking awesome, man. That's cool to see. Say what you want about lists in general and whatever, and say whatever the hell you want about Pitchfork, but dude, that's awesome, man. A publication that big, I think that it's even in Rolling Stone top 500. That's fucking awesome.
Yeah. Corndogs from Pedro.
Yeah, just some corndogs from Pedro and the fucking the top 500 records of all time. It's cool, and it's cool to be a product of that in a certain way.
I bet.
Yeah.
And my last question is, we always grade the movie on a scale from 1 to 10.
Ooh.
On a scale from 1 being the not good to 10 being the highest, how many spiels on a scale from 1 to 10 would you give this film?
You know what? Just because 10 feels cheap, I'm gonna give it 9 spiels.
9 spiels. I think I'm with you. I think I love it.
Yeah.
It's great.
It's great. I love it, man. I love it.
Thank you so much, Nick. It was really great to see you.
Dude, it was great to see you. It was even better to talk with you about this too. Sorry if I rambled a bit, but I don't know. I get very passionate about the things I love.
That's why I wanted to talk to you. I really appreciate it. And have a great tour.
Thanks so much, man.
Thank you for listening to Revolutions Per Movie. We release new episodes every Thursday, so be sure to search for the show on your favorite podcast app and subscribe to the show. And if you've enjoyed this, it would mean a lot to me if you would rate and review it as well. You can follow us on social media at Revolutions Per Movie, and also find out more information about our various guests in the episode show notes. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week. Bye!